If you've got big dreams and bad jeans, you are in the right place. These shirts are brand new. They're live at barbellapparel.com. Link is in the description. Today, we're going to cover one of my favorite topics, the overhead press in all of its forms. So I wanted to shine a little bit of light on the different variations to clear up some misconceptions, give a couple of clutch technical pointers that I think are très importante, and then we are going to go over what we do best, which is some programming discussion. We'll talk about how you would structure this stuff in a week, why you might make one decision over another, and then we'll gloss over some progression schemes to give you everything you need to know to get that overhead press cherried out. So starting out, we're going to cover the differences. Most of you know these already, but hopefully I can add a little bit of context to it. The three big ones as a strongman competitor, somebody who has to specialize in overhead pressing, the three big ones that I see the most, that I think are the most common, and the ones that are most likely to pop up as your main lift, is a strict press, a push press, and a jerk. Now, going over the basics, a strict press is obviously just bars starting around the collarbone, at least below the chin, getting driven overhead with just the effort from your upper body. The push press utilizes leg drive, so you start with a little dip, drive as you press up, and then lastly we have a jerk, Olympic lifting. You're going to dip, use your legs to drive up into the bar, and then you're going to sneak back underneath it. So this takes the arms out of the movement quite a bit. So it's a lot of legs, a lot of explosiveness, a ton of skill, and a ton of timing. Now in strongman, you see variations of all of these. At the extremes, you'll see former Olympic lifting champions who have utilized their skill in the jerk they've built over a lifetime to do pretty well in some of the odder events, log presses, axle presses. And on the other extreme, you'll have guys like Eddie Hall and Iron Bibby who can just strict press anything overhead because they have shoulders the size of the average powerlifter's glutes. So those represent the extremes. The question is, what do us guys in the middle do? What does the average guy do who probably isn't going to have a strict press that is bigger than most guys' squats, that probably isn't going to be able to spend 20 years refining their jerk so that it transfers over to everything? And that's the middle ground. I'm going to make the case that most of you, in strongman at least, should be push pressing because it has the most transferability, carries over to the most number of things, and it's also pretty good for general development. Now, most of you guys watching probably aren't going to be strongmen, so you have to weigh what your main lift is going to be a little bit differently. You have to find the balance. So picking it apart, I mean, a strict press is going to be a primary developer of the shoulders and triceps because that's all it uses. So that's where it puts all of the stress. You go through a lot of range of motion. The muscles are tensed throughout the entire range of motion. So for that reason, it's better for hypertrophy than the other options. It is a pure upper body test of strength. Again, everything's getting put on the shoulders and triceps. It's easiest to recover from too because it relies solely on the smaller muscles of your arms. It's a self-limiting exercise. You're not going to load up the weight the way you would in the other two. So it's a little easier to recover from. It's also not going to beat up the knees and hips as much from all the dipping and driving. But you are limited on load. There's a limit to how much weight you can handle. That could be a positive or a negative. It's a positive as far as recovery goes if you're just training specifically for hypertrophy. It's a negative though if you're really trying to exploit your ability to handle weight by using your legs so that your upper back, your midsection, your trunk, everything has to adapt to the extra weight. You have to adapt to the violent explosiveness. You have to adapt to the extra weight you can handle at arm's length. So there definitely is some trade-off, but generally this is the backbone of overhead pressing, of upper body development. I didn't specify this, but overhead pressing is like this very blanket term. On the forums back in the day, like 20 years ago, this argument broke out and it was loosely settled on that overhead press means anything that gets the weight over your head, and it encompasses all of these. So generally you're gonna hear people say it very loosely. If they're specifically talking about a strict press, specifically talking about one of these, if you want to specify, you have to mention these by name because people take overhead to mean like generally anything. So don't assume people know what you're talking about. It's a very blanket term. So going from a strict press to a push press, now you're using your legs. Now the sole point of using your legs is going to be to get more weight overhead. That's the only reason you would do it. If you're trying to absolutely torch your delts, you might cheat a little bit towards the end as a means of keeping tension on the delts and taking the set out longer. But that's generally not what we mean when we say push press. That's generally not what we're talking about. We're usually talking about a specific technical approach that allows you to drive more weight overhead and to do so in a very explosive style. You can grind a strict press. It's a lot harder to grind a push press, and you can't grind a jerk at all. So as explosiveness comes into the equation. Now you're talking about more performance development. We're getting your nervous system on point. We are teaching you to recruit more motor units and to do so in a shorter period of time. And there's a lot of value to that, both athletically, but also as a means of getting bigger, stronger shoulders. That's something I've noticed. This has been my bread and butter for probably 15 years now. I started out with a sloppy push jerk. I transitioned to a push press because even though I could get under a good amount of weight on a bar or log, if it was a sandbag, a dumbbell, something awkward, if I was on uneven terrain, I couldn't jerk to save my life, and I couldn't stabilize. So push pressing was the workaround. So this allows you to use more weight. Your feet don't really move. Your heels pop up off the ground, but your feet don't move. So you're a little more stable, which is clutch in strongman. More load. So immediately, if you've never push pressed before, immediately your entire body has to adapt to every rep, every session now being this explosive effort, this coordination of your upper back, your midsection, your shoulders. That has a developmental effect. If you've never done it before and you commit to doing it, assuming that you're not so off-center that you have to drop the weight 50%. Guys that are very, very strong in a strict press, like right now, if I was just strict pressing, I'd have a hard time handling the same amount of weight. It takes a while to get the skill in. But most of you lower level to middle tier intermediate guys should be able to immediately push press as much, if not more, than you strict press. That means you're going to get an immediate growth effect. And that can be kind of addicting. You do that and you're like, I never want to go back to strict pressing again. It is pretty good for hypertrophy. It's not as good specifically. If you're a hypertrophy guy, you have to weigh out if the juice is worth the squeeze, because it is pretty good. You're going to handle more load. It might be a novel stimulus, which might be good, but it's also a lot more taxing. Again, that extra weight comes at a cost. No such thing as a free cookie, not in nature, not in the gym. So the fact that it does require a little bit from your legs, from your knees, if you're just on a vicious like hypertrophy split, this might be hard to throw in when your legs are toast from all the shit you did on leg day, when your upper back is toast from all the rows. This can create a different element of complexity. So if you are just focused on hypertrophy, I mean, these are fun as shit to do, but use it sparingly. Keep in mind what your primary concern is. And again, it's the most efficient for strongman. Feet are stable, but you get the benefit of leg drive. And when you get good, and I got very good at these, I just need, if I'm on uneven turf, I just need my feet grounded enough where I can get just a little leg drive and then I can finish it off at the top, and that works great. Now, the benefit of a push press, if we're gonna get into the nitty gritty, if I start with an elevated position, think of an elevated squat, elevated deadlift, any lift elevated, you're a bit stronger. If I start right here from the pins and I push, I'm gonna be a lot stronger than if I start from the bottom. It's a more mechanically advantaged position. That's why if you see somebody doing presses like this, you're like, oh, you're cheating, it's easier. Now, the thing is with a push press, not only do you get the momentum from your legs that gets that bar traveling upwards, so that by the time you're at that same spot, the bar is essentially lighter because it has upward momentum. But wait, there's more. It takes a certain amount of time to hit maximal motor recruitment. So when I start right here and I start pushing, it takes a second, a half second, a second to get firing on all cylinders. And the more advanced you are, the better an athlete you are, the shorter that time is. But you start recruiting, and then after about a second, you're firing on all cylinders, you break that sucker, you drive it to lockout. With a push press, you have the benefit of all of this time on the way up. You're pushing. So by the time you're right here, not only is there momentum on the bar, but you're at maximal motor recruitment. That sucker pops to lockout. And you can get very, very good at that. If you've ever seen Klokov lift, he did something, it was almost 500 pounds. At like 230, 235, he did like a 496 push press. And you can see that in action. You can see the explosiveness, the timing, the skill. You have the potential to get very good. And because you're still under tension, there's mechanical tension the whole way, it's something that also has a very good strength and size developmental effect. So anyways, that's my bias. I'm in love with the push press, obviously. So as long as you can deal with the fact that it's taxing, which some of you hypertrophy guys, probably some of you powerlifters aren't gonna wanna mess with, it is a very good, very useful tool for development that a lot of people don't do unless they're forced into a strongman contest. And lastly, as a jerk, I'm not going to talk about this too much. In strongman, it pops up the most. If you're an Olympic lifter, what are you doing watching this? Go watch Tellender, go watch an Olympic lifting coach. That is a very specific school. That's a very specific discipline. That is over my head. I'm not going to tell anybody here who wants to be an Olympic lifter how they should be programming that, because it's a different animal entirely. We get hints of that a type of programming that pop up in here, but as an entire discipline, you got to take it seriously. You're not going to get that here. Now, strongmen, there's some strongmen who do pop into the jerk category, and they're usually guys that are really good athletes who figured out how to sneak under the weight, and it's kind of intuitive, and they've drugged that along, or it's guys that do spend a ton of time mastering it. And given that strongman averages 1 overhead event for every 5 or so events, how many days out of the week are you going to drill a jerk in order to get better at your jerk? What happens with most guys is that they're underdeveloped. So if your max strict press is 115, you can probably do a shitty jerk with like 160 just by muscling it over. Now, as the weight gets heavier, what's going to happen is you're going to see, oh my God, I'm almost at that competitive weight. The jerk is my ticket to there because you just jumped everything forward, but you're not getting that growth behind it from strict pressing. So all the jerking takes over. Let's say you get to the point where you don't zero in the overhead. Hey, that's great. But you haven't developed the strength required to do all the other events. So you're going to bomb out if it is an awkward movement, if it's something you're not used to, if it's for reps. What you find on the other end from seasoned Olympic lifters is they've spent their entire life, like Koklyaev is a great example. He was a Russian weightlifting champion. He had like a 550 clean and jerk. He still topped out somewhere around a 440 log. So the question is, are you going to spend your entire life developing yourself for a jerk, or is that the long way to go around? If you're a strongman, you have to take care of these different qualities. So it's better to find the middle ground that's going to give the most transfer to everything else, instead of spending all of the time needing to develop this skill that's going to leave your upper body behind. The potential for weight's the greatest, but you can't do a split jerk for a lot of reps. That'll gas you out. There's very few guys that do that. You look at somebody like Rob Kearney, even when he jerked, it was a short, shallow, kind of shitty jerk. And he probably wouldn't be that much worse if he just push pressed. Camby is the same way. Camby's excellent at the jerk, but his best jerk, I believe, is only 20 or 30 pounds ahead of his push press. And if you spend all of that volume, all of that practice push pressing, there's an argument to be made that he'd be better off and it would transfer over to more things. That's my 2 cents, but that's neither here nor there. If you're not a strongman, you're not an Olympic lifter, there's really no reason for you to do this because it has the worst transfer over to general upper body strength and to general physical development. So why bother? Guys, if I can help fund this channel and help you solve a problem, I call that a win-win. So please allow me one moment to preach the good word of Boost Camp. I tend to get a little complex when I'm writing workout plans. Tracking progress for these programs is hugely important, but options were never great. I would write these long, complex progressions by hand into a notebook, or I would carry a binder filled with spreadsheets I printed off of LiftVault. That's why I'm here to introduce you to Boost Camp. Boost Camp is the easy way to track training progress directly from your phone. Their library of programs features countless dozens of powerlifting and hypertrophy-specific programs from your favorite creators, including Jeffrey Verity Schofield, Johnny Candido, Eric Helms, Greg Nuckols, Alberto Nunez, and of course, yours truly. Boost Camp also has exclusive programs that you just won't find anywhere else. Select the one best suited to your needs and watch the sets, reps, weights, and exercises populate automatically. Don't guess at that one weight you lifted that one time for how many reps again? Have your log of training with you at all times for easy reference in the convenience of your phone. Not only does Boost Camp have a stellar product, but their support is the only reason this channel exists. So thank you, the viewer, and thank you to Boost Camp. Check it out today. The link is in the description. Going on to technique. So assuming we've settled on either a strict press or a push press, it's going to be pretty similar for you guys as far as hand positioning, and the same rules apply. The difference is, are you jumping into the weight or are you not? So as far as grip goes, the big thing to worry about, are you wide or are you narrow? Is your thumb wrapped? Are you going thumbless? Wide or narrow is going to default to where you're the most comfortable. I'm not going to give you one recommendation. Like Rip-A-Toe and that school of thought really emphasizes compression in the elbow, and that's great. The tighter you grab, you're going to feel your lats, your bicep. Your biceps contribute a shit ton at the start of a press. So if you pack in tight, man, it feels like you're wearing 5 pairs of elbow sleeves, and that's great. Trade-off, it is mechanical compression. It's like artificial compression. So there's an argument to be made that if you're a little more exposed, that has a better developmental effect. Also, rebounding, if you're one to rebound heavily like I do, that can take its toll on your bicep tendon because of that compression. So not only are you going to feel that distally if that wears on you, but you're going to feel it in the proximal tendon that's up in your shoulder. And I had some nasty tendonitis from that compression, from the rebounding. So that's something to be aware of. I recommend getting somewhere where you feel snug and in control, but don't kill yourself trying to get your hands all the way in by your ears. Also a little wider. There's some guys that are very widely built and they feel strong out here. You're gonna see that. There's no real wrong or right answer here. There's just trade-offs. Developmentally, the delts are going to get hit a little bit harder when your hands are out wider, but you go through more range of motion when they're closer, but that's going to tax your bicep tendon a little more and have a little more artificial compression. Might be a good thing, might be a bad thing. A lot to consider. I recommend just grabbing somewhere about around your shoulders and go from there based on comfort. The thumb, I feel strongest with a thumbless grip. A lot of people do. It's said to be better for tricep activation. I feel like my wrist is a lot more stable, which is a big one. However, thumbless, you've seen guys dump a bench press with a suicide grip. That can also happen on an overhead. I haven't seen it, but it stands to reason. I've gotten a little iffy on certain movements where I'm really pushing it. It stands to reason that should happen on an overhead press as well over a long enough period of time. That's going to be a lot more devastating, dropping it on your head versus dropping it on your chest. So I really do recommend against it unless you're very comfortable getting your hands all the way back and really making sure you've got a nice secure shelf. But wrapping the thumb can be good because you can squeeze. Squeezing the bar like it owes you money, that creates a radiation. So all of the tension in your elbow up through your shoulder and your lats, everything gets tighter. You can get a lot of power. When I do wrap my thumb, I can't do that on an axle, so I'm like more inclined to go thumbless. But on a bar, sometimes I'll wrap my thumb, and if I squeeze really hard, I just need a little wrist wrap on to create that stability I'm missing in my wrist, and all is well. So a couple of things to consider. So the bicep and lat compression is huge, and you can see it from the side. If you're really squeezing right here, if I'm going seated out of a rack where I'm taking the weight out and bringing it down, I'm focusing on tightening my biceps and my lats on the way down to create compression. If I'm taking it out of a rack or if I'm cleaning it, I'm looking at finding that compression first. So out of a rack, I'll actively squeeze my lats and biceps and physically create that compression as I take it out. As I clean it, it's a little bit harder, but you have to take a second, get your elbows in position, and I'll just physically kind of pull in before I go into my push press, and that works pretty well. For standing, we are going to assume that your main lift is standing. That's the benchmark. Of course, seated is a variation, it's viable. But if we're doing a standing strict press or if we're doing a push press, you're either cleaning it or taking it out of a rack and you have to set up. For a strict press, squeezing the legs, the ass and the quads, that is huge. It is underrated. They don't talk about that much. Squeezing right before you go, that moment, you've already got tension through your hands, through your delts, through your shoulders. Right before you go, squeeze your ass, and you'll notice that it feels like you're doing a seated press. So more efficient force transfer, which is absolutely great. When you do a push press, you do that by default anyways because you have to gear up for that dip to be ready to drop and drive. So that's kind of a default. With elbow position, high is conducive to a jerk. Do not crank your elbows up if you're trying to strict press. That is a horrible idea. I actually prefer my elbows down even when I push press because especially in strongman, it's unstable, things are unruly. So I actually like the extra purchase I get. Even if it's not as efficient, a perfectly efficient push press on a barbell is going to look kind of like a jerk where the elbows are going to be real high and it's going to be all legs. And there's some Olympic lifters that are good at that. But for practical purposes, for cycling through reps, for getting your upper body to grow, and for doing other odd objects, I like having my elbows under the bar. I just feel a little bit better. You just have to make sure the path is straight up so you don't beam yourself in the chin. So it's really just pushing your head back. The last point here, and this is a big one. I only discovered recently. I don't hear people talk about this. Does your head move forward or do you keep your head back looking at the sky if you're doing a strict press or sometimes even a push press? You can see examples of both. When you watch someone like an Iron Bibby press, his head stays back. It looks like he's just doing an incline bench, right? So he's real stable. He's got his glutes squeezed, he's leaning back, and he can just keep this nice tight vertical movement. And it's not very complex. It looks like it's very efficient for him. Usually what they teach is that you get your head back, and as that bar clears your nose, you get upright by pushing your head forward and locking the bar out. And the idea is that's a mechanically stronger position because you're bringing the bar directly over your shoulder as you get upright and push your head through. I'm not sure how it works out that way. I feel much stronger, and I feel like reps are way more efficient when I stay looking up at the sky. You'll find examples of both. I'm not going to tell you one is right, one is wrong. I would do what's comfortable, decide what it is, and make that your bread and butter. I do not recommend going back and forth because you can't decide. It's better to pick one and do it and get comfortable with it than it is to jump back and forth, because there is very much some skill to be developed here. Bringing the head through really comes into play when I'm on something like a Viking press, learning how to push myself through. It's almost like hitching a deadlift, but for your shoulders. So I just have to get it over my head. And once it's over my head, I can reposition, and that becomes a much stronger position. However, it's more unstable. So leaning back, staying looking at the sky is a more stable fixed position. It may just not be the most efficient for pressing. There's a trade-off there. Now, the last point I want to cover is for strict pressing, the rebound. This is another point of contention. Some people want it to the collarbone from a dead stop. Other people, again, Ripito, the starting strength crew that kind of made overhead pressing popular again, they like the rebound. I'm a fan of rebounding on reps. A gentle rebound, same reason I like rebounding on squats, same reason I like rebounding on bench presses. I feel like it is better for cycling through reps. Yes, you're targeting the hardest position to lift when everything's stretched out, you're in this disadvantaged position. That's a great point of disadvantagedness that can potentially lead to extra growth. So you're seeing a resurgence. This was news to me up until a couple months ago, but you're seeing a resurgence of people doing paused benches, all of their reps paused. Israel does that. I talked to Sam Sheether. He says he does the same thing. And that's interesting. I hadn't really ever seen that done, but there's some people that really like that, making the hardest part just a staple, like resetting all of your deadlifts. However, I found that when I started doing a lot of touch and go deadlifts, or when I started doing a lot of RDLs where there isn't a pause at the bottom, I got a lot of growth. I feel like the ratio of work and weight that you can do for an entire set is just greater than if you're going to make the bottom position the hardest possible. It just stands to reason. If that wasn't the case, it seems like everybody would be pausing every exercise at the bottom, and we really don't do that. So that's just my 2 cents. It probably doesn't matter. For those of you guys that get really picky about whether you rebound or whether you don't, probably doesn't matter long term. Again, they have trade-offs. So whatever benefit you get from going one way, it's going to be taken out in some other trade-off that you have on the other side. Yes, you might get an extra developmental boost from making it really hard right off the bottom, but hey, you're gonna be limited on how many reps you can do or by how much weight you can handle. So those trade-offs are very real. Also, going below the chin, I don't know where the standard of going to the collarbone came from. I don't know if that was a competition standard back when the press was in the Olympics. I don't know if that was a competition standard anywhere else, but I hear a lot of guys reference, oh, I go to the collarbone. I posted a video of me doing a standing strict press. It was 275 for 8 from years back when I was actually strong. And I got a lot of comments like, you're not going to your collarbone, bro, it's cheating. And it's like, hey, if those are your standards, that's great. Train to where you think the minimum impressive range is, if that's what you're focused on. The chin is universally a standard in contest. Again, look how many places test the overhead press. That's where your standard should be as far as what counts. Strongman, you get guys that physically are bound and can't get to their collarbone, so you make them go to their chin, and that's the gold standard. Getting to your chin, that's a very substantial range of motion. I mean, look at the angle. If I was starting at a front raise from here, that's a very, anything below that, you're getting quite a bit of stretch. And again, trade-off. More stretch means less weight, so somewhere in the balance. I think anything below the chin flies. That's where you have to get a Viking press. It's got to get below your ears. A barbell's got to start below your chin. That's the gold standard. And it's not necessarily harder to go down if you are sufficiently built up. When I'm built up, the compression that comes from getting lower, and you'll see guys do this. You see Larry Wheels, when he did like a 440 standing strict press, he started up high. He actually pulled down before he pressed, because there's a slingshot effect. He's so tight that he got mechanical compression that helped build momentum on the way up. So it's not necessarily easier to start up at your chin. A lot of guys, the extra compression actually makes it harder. And that's neither here nor there. The bottom line is, I don't necessarily see one way of overhead pressing. If your elbows are under the bar, if you're not like internally rotated where you're trying to press like this, just make sure that elbow's under the bar, the wrist is tight, wherever your grip is, wherever the rack is, just be consistent. That's the most important thing you can do. All right, so we covered the main lifts, gave some technical insight, talked about when you might do one or the other. Now let's break down how you would put this into a program, there's a lot of variety. So I'm going to give a surface level discussion of when one might be appropriate over another. Firstly, figure out, is this your main lift? Are you overhead pressing because that's what you care about? Are you a strongman? Do you just really want to take some time and chase that 300-pound standing military press? Or is it a co-lift? Are you running a program where both are treated kind of comparably, same type of progression, same amount of work? Or is it an accessory? If it's an accessory, that means there's not a lot of wrong answers. It's just the work you're doing after you bench press or after you do more important exercises. And really, you're just trying to find a movement you like, find a sustainable way to push it week to week in just about any rep range. And as long as you're seeing progress week to week, you're going to get some growth, and that's great. There's not a lot of wrong answers. It's probably going to be some strict press variation. Might be a machine, might be behind the neck. It might be a standing military press. You might be doing it for 5 reps, might be doing it for 20 reps. There's fewer wrong answers with that. So I'm more concerned with people that put it front and center as a priority, at least as important as their bench press work. So for a main lift, it means it's going to be your heaviest lift, your hardest high effort work is going to be featured in that lift, and it's going to have the most frequency, meaning it's going to be done repeatedly throughout the week. So if you're benching 3 times per week, overhead pressing twice per week, overhead press is an accessory, and you want to treat it that way because you can't do everything heavy all the time. So choose what your priority is. We're going to cover basic 1, 2, and 3 day per week split. Anything beyond that, I really don't recommend. High frequency stuff is doable. It might be beneficial, but it has its own learning curve, and recovery is hard to balance. And figuring out what decisions to make on each day, you end up just winging it. There's a less clear flow chart of what to do. So I'm not a huge fan of that. Not a lot of guys that do that at the top. So 1 day per week. You got day 1, that's your 1 overhead press day. It's your main lift. So it's going to be heavy. Any strength progression I've ever covered can be applied to this. I've covered a million of them in base strength and peak strength. So if you want ideas, you can go check those out. I've covered it on like the bench press checklist video. I have a few of those. Any strength progression video, I have a bunch of those. Any one you like, you can fix that here. It might be something like just a heavy top set followed by a back off set, and you try to add weight over 3 or 4 weeks before resetting. It might be sets across. I'm doing 5 sets of 8, and I'm trying to increase the average weight I handle or increase the heaviest weight I handle. There's a lot of different ways to do it so that you have the amount of work and that you're building up. I generally like things that are kind of reverse pyramid-y, meaning you start with a heavyish set and then you climb down. You might do a couple sets a little bit lighter. You might drop again and do an AMRAP set. I think we called that the hexagon approach. Top set, a couple of working sets lighter, followed by 1 lighter AMRAP set. So it might be, a 3, followed by a few sets of 6, followed by like a 12 or 15. It's a good way to cover a lot of bases. Now, if you're going 1 day a week, that means you have a lot of work on your overhead press. You got to get your money's worth because you're going to have 7 days to recover. This has to be a pretty big stress. Follow it up. You can do some benching as a secondary movement because those pressing muscles get hit and it'll contribute. Or you can do other overhead press accessory. Maybe there's a variation you like to do. You have a lot of options, and you follow it up with your isolation. 1 day a week, I'm going to be doing 6 to 10 exercises total because I need to cover my other upper body stuff, biceps, triceps, lats, isolated delt work. There's a lot of stuff to be done. Even if I have that stuff on another day and I'm just pressing, I can do a lot of pressing work if I'm just pressing 1 day per week. So I recommend this specifically for people that are in a caloric surplus. I would not recommend doing it cutting, or people that know that they grow pretty easily from a stimulus. Some of you might notice that one individual workout doesn't do a lot. If you do a few touches on the same lift throughout the week, you might feel better, you might feel stronger, you might feel like that does a better job. So you bigger guys, you fast gainers, if you're on gear, it's something you can get away with more easily. Specifically, if you're just eating a shit ton of calories, that makes that much, much more viable. Now, for the rest of you that maybe don't fit into that box, you're gonna look at higher frequency. 2 days per week is probably the most common of what I recommend. And a 2 day per week split, if overhead pressing is your main lift, you're looking at 2 overhead pressing workouts within 1 week. You're probably going to offset it. I don't recommend, unless you're doing a linear progression where you're just doing like a few sets of 5 and adding weight every single time you do it. It's more of a novice, a newbie type of approach. If you have anything that looks like strength, it's most sustainable if you have your heavier day to focus on, and day 2 is a lighter day. It could be a lighter exercise, maybe heavy standing strict press, on day 1 and maybe you're doing behind the neck on day 2. Or maybe you're doing standing strict press on both and this is just back off work. The effort's a little bit lower. Or maybe it's a different rep range. A lot of options. Again, check out my books. I go more into depth than that. And then you follow that up with your accessory. Maybe it's benching. Maybe it's a secondary overhead press exercise. Depends on your goals and what you think is going to get you there quicker. And then going into the 3-day per week split, notice that the number of exercises is dropping. You can't do as much work. You're taking it and just kind of smearing it out throughout the week as you add more days. So really the benefit here, it's not that you're doing exponentially more volume total throughout the week, although it might be a bit higher. It's really that you're fresher for the effort that you do. So on average, the same amount of work, you're going to handle more weight, you're going to be crisper, technique's going to be better. So there's some advantages. Higher frequency stuff, think of more as skill work. The skill element is going to be a lot higher. Where this stuff, this is scorched earth. Skill work, it's going to be around for a couple sets. Everything after that is just fatigue. You're trying to just build up stress to get yourself to grow so you can justify that 7 days of recovery. Heavy, medium, light is a good approach. For example, if you're doing like a top set of 5 on the heavy day, mediums might be lighter sets of 5 for a few repeating sets. Light might be a couple sets even lighter than that, and that's a good split. And then you progress all of that forward 5 or 10 pounds each time you come in. You can do that for 4 or 5 weeks before you reset. DUP, similar feel. You're changing the threshold, but you're working specifically in different rep ranges at different percentages. So day 1, heavy might be 3s, medium might be 6s, light might be 10s. And you can see how the effort's going to be a bit different there than if you're keeping the reps the same. So this is a basic spread of how I would handle an overhead press if it's the main lift on a 1, 2, or 3 times per week frequency. And of course, you can apply the same type of reason to other lifts, to benching, to squatting. So if we get into co-lift territory, maybe you don't want to be an overhead press specialist. Maybe, just maybe, you want to be an all-around badass motherfucker. So you got some time dedicated to overhead pressing, but you also, maybe you bench, or maybe you do dips, maybe you do some ring work, and they all interest you, and that's fine. So in a co-lift scenario, you just really have to make sure that you're not interfering. That's the benefit of having it the main lift, is because you can easily arrange everything else. It's not so important, so you don't have to go so hard on everything. You can easily arrange everything else to take second fiddle to the overhead press, so you don't have to worry about being under recovered for that big heavy day. When it's a co-lift, a little more care has to be taken into it. A good example of this is like 5-3-1. So you have 2 upper body days. You bench on one day, you overhead press on the other day. There's another approach I call a blended split, where let's say you're doing 2 upper body days, 2 lower body days. Well, you might do squat and deadlift work on both lower body days. You might bench and overhead press on both upper body days. And the most symmetrical way to do it is to have an overhead press day, a bench day, and then swap. So you do the secondary work after the main work for the opposite lift. So day 1, heavy overhead press stuff, followed by bench accessory. And you don't have to worry about if you're a little fatigued. You don't have to worry about if you're not at your strongest. It's just some supplementary volume and skill work for the bench. Day 2, you would bench and then follow it up with the supplementary overhead work. Again, not really worrying about if it's going to blow you out. And that is pretty sustainable. It's pretty easy to follow that and get the best of all worlds. Wouldn't really recommend that if you're a power lifter. You want to be a little more focused. Might not even recommend that for a strongman. Again, you want to be a little more focused. But for the all-arounders, it is absolutely viable. You could get pretty damn big and strong doing that. And then a 3-day per week split. Again, if you're doing the co-lift thing, Gray Skull, it's a good template, good example of this. I really like this one for higher frequency. Overhead press, bench, overhead press, and then you just continue to alternate. So this is an example of the 7-day per week being annoying, pain in the ass, so we just get rid of it. So you could do this where you have 2 different progressions you're running, overhead 1, overhead 2, maybe a heavy and a light. You do the same for bench. So you get through 4 unique workouts in a little over a week, and then you reset. So that goes from 7-day to about a 9 or 10-day split. And some of you might notice that's a sweet spot. 7 days is really awkward because if you drag everything to every other week, that's not enough. If you try to cram it into 1 week, that can be too much. Right here, if you feel this alternating heavy alternate or heavy light, and it's still a little bit too much, consider doing something where you drag it out into about a week and a half, and that goes very well. By the time you get to that heavy touch with the same lift, like 9-10 days later, you'll be surprised how good you feel. Really, especially if you're like me, if you're prone to inflammation, joint stuff, that can be a godsend. Now, Grayscale LP is pretty simplified because it's a linear progression. You do your 5s on overhead, then you do your 5s on bench, and then the next day you come back in and you increase. So on this gray skull split, you're still adding 5 pounds each time. But if you, again, go to an alternating overhead 1, bench 1, overhead 2, bench 2, good way to take those hard efforts, spread them out. A lot of options to go over here. They are all viable. Consider deeply what your primary focus is. Is it your main lift? Do I want to be a strongman overhead pressing machine? Well, you're not gonna co-lift this stuff. You make your main stuff, make your main goal, your focus, and arrange everything else around that. Say, what is my tolerance for recovery? Can I recover from 3 days per week of reasonably hard efforts with the same lift? Well, you got to back the amount of work off. You're not going to be able to do as much supplementary work, isolation, accessory work, and also it might chew up your joints. Now, if you can handle it and go hard on this stuff, you might reap the benefit of the frequency, and it might be the ticket that just takes you to the next level. Honestly, evaluate your tolerance. If you've had elbow and shoulder pain, this is off the table. Go down. I've actually had a lot of success once a week because I'm super susceptible to inflammation. I'm in a caloric surplus. If you can't tell, I've gotten a little fluffy. My wife's pregnant. We're eating Panda Express every single night. I mean, we're going to Subway, getting 3 subs, mowing them down, going out to get Ben and Jerry's. It's been a mess. But because I'm a little bit more of an easy gainer, and because I'm eating just everything in sight, I can handle this. My joints feel great. So it's all about you, what you can tolerate, and how much work you need in order to spark growth. And it's a delicate balance, a little bit different for everybody. Once you have this set up, all you have to do is populate it with good accessory exercises to make sure, your back, again, back biceps, they contribute to compression, to stability. Those get bigger, your ability to overhead press gets bigger. Maybe your triceps are small. Okay, how do I fit tricep work on top of this? It's gonna translate. My favorite exercises, extensions. It could be a jam, a French, a skull crusher. Again, if your elbows can handle it. Some of you might be able to do things like cable press downs. And as long as you're going hard and progressing, your triceps grow and they contribute. Everybody has a different spread, tolerance. And then my favorite overhead presses. This is where breaking stuff into blocks comes in a little bit. You have more developmental stuff for your shoulders and triceps, your basic pressing ability. Things that are lighter, a little more unstable, put you in a little bit of a weaker position. Great for growth, less good for strength. Dumbbell shoulder pressing, behind the neck pressing, any type of machine pressing. It's a really good secondary movement. The overhead's kind of a dumb movement. It's not like the difference between a squat and a leg press, because a squat is much more technical and precise. An overhead press is kind of a dumb movement. You can absolutely get a lot of mileage out of machine presses as a secondary option. Heavier stuff. This is going to be more load, more neurologically driven, better for developing that top end strength. Dips are great, weighted dips. My God, I love them. Seated presses, much more stable, so you can handle a lot more weight. And some of you powerlifters might just prefer doing seated presses anyways, because why not? You're a power lifter. If you wanted to put out extra effort, you would have gone and played a real sport. But you're here to eat Sour Patch Kids and to kick your feet up for 10 minutes in between sets. Seated presses are the way to go. But in all seriousness, it is a very viable way to get your shoulders stronger, contribute to the bench press without causing unnecessary taxation that might interfere with your bench. And I'm a big fan of pin presses. I do those closer to contest when the weights get heavy. Do not start with pin presses. Do pin presses on the back end of the developmental work you did in the beginning. So after so many weeks where it's like, oh shit, my strict press is starting to get really good. In the last few weeks of a really heavy block, start to experiment at the chin, at the nose, maybe even at the forehead, and you'll notice that it adds a nice little bit of icing on top of the cake. So I'm a big fan of that. As far as exact progressions go, do not get caught up in finding the perfect progression. There's a million of them. You do not get bonus points for doing them all, just like you don't get bonus points for running through all of these. This is not bingo. You're not supposed to run through each one at some point in your life. Make decisions based off a good educated guess of what you can get away with. That's your staple. That's just what you do now. Don't look at the other ones, all right? Treat it like you're in a relationship and she'll cut your dick off if she catches you looking at any of the other ones. That's not on the table. That's a good way to expend a lot of energy and get nowhere. As far as the exact progressions, are you doing, top sets and back off sets? Are you doing sets across? Are you doing this wacky wave shit you saw over here? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The point is not to do the exact right amount of work. The point is to find a set amount of work, progress over time. That should be very freeing. So find one that's reasonable, allows you to get through the workout in the amount of time that you like, and focus on doing a little bit more each week, 4 or 5, maybe 6 weeks, deload or reset or move forward to another phase. Again, Base Strength, Peak Strength for more information on programming, or any one of the too many videos I put out on programming to give you insight for that. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I know this was exhaustive. Hopefully we get some future Strongman World records out of this. If you have any questions, take you to Patreon. That's where you can contact me directly. Big Dreams, Bad Dreams shirt at Barbell Apparel. And we got the Strength Conquers in the front print. I had to beg for that, but we got the Strength Conquers in the front print. So that is all at barbellapparel.com. Link in the description. Thank you so much, guys. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.